You're standing at the peak of absolute power. Your empire spans 3 continents, your armies number in the hundreds of thousands, and right now a reckless young warrior who barely knows how to grow a proper beard has wandered straight into your territory. But here's the beautiful part: through sheer strategic brilliance, you've managed to maneuver your entire military force behind him. His supply lines cut, his escape routes blocked, his options exactly zero. He's pinned against the sea like a cornered wolf, and all you have to do is close the jaws of your trap. Victory isn't just likely, it's mathematically certain. At least, that's what King Darius III convinced himself of in the fall of 331 BC, staring down at a 23-year-old Macedonian commander named Alexander. But hold on, before I reveal how this seemingly perfect scenario turned into one of history's most catastrophic miscalculations, do me a favor and smash that subscribe button. Ring that notification bell too, because what I'm about to show you is a masterclass in how genius-level strategy can flip an impossible situation completely upside down. This story literally rewrote the map of human civilization, and trust me, you've never heard it told quite like this. What transpired on the narrow beaches of Issus in November 333 BC would demolish every assumption about numerical superiority, military might, and the true meaning of tactical dominance. This wasn't merely another violent clash in an era defined by warfare. This was warfare elevated to an art form, a perfectly choreographed symphony of calculated violence that military academies would dissect with reverence for the next 2,000 years. The young Macedonian king, whose reputation was only beginning to inspire whispers of awe and terror across the ancient world, was about to prove something terrifying: that when armies collide, the sharpest weapon isn't always the longest spear or the largest cavalry. Sometimes it's the mind of a commander who can see 3 moves ahead of everyone else. The hunter was about to become the hunted. The trap was about to become a coffin. And one man's strategic genius was about to outweigh 100,000 soldiers. The stage was illuminated for one of antiquity's most shocking reversals of fortune. On one side stood Darius III, the King of Kings, heir to the Achaemenid throne, a global superpower that had dominated the known world for over 2 centuries, built by legendary rulers like Cyrus the Great. This man commanded military forces that stretched beyond counting, with seemingly bottomless reserves of manpower and treasure flowing from the Asian heartland. He represented the established world order, the protector of an empire that had never met its equal. On the opposite side stood Alexander, leading what could only be described as a relatively modest but ferociously disciplined force of Macedonians and Greeks, operating 1,000 miles beyond their homeland, dangling at the end of impossibly stretched supply lines. He wasn't merely an invader. He was a human storm system, powered by an almost supernatural ambition, what the ancient Greeks called pothos, an insatiable hunger to push beyond every known horizon, to test the very limits of fate itself. What unfolded next in the mud and rushing waters of the Pinarus River would decide far more than which king would claim victory. It would determine the entire arc of Western civilization for millennia to come. To truly grasp the magnitude of what was about to occur at Issus, you need to understand the sheer, almost incomprehensible scale of the Persian superpower that Darius commanded. We're not talking about just another kingdom here. This was the undisputed heavyweight champion of the ancient world, a sophisticated, sprawling political entity that had maintained absolute dominance for over 2 centuries since Cyrus the Great first forged it. In every meaningful sense, this was an empire where the sun genuinely never set. The Achaemenid Persian Empire stretched across 3 continents in a sprawling web of power that encompassed what we'd recognize today as at least 20 modern nations. It swallowed up ancient Mesopotamia in present-day Iraq, the historic kingdoms of Anatolia in modern Turkey, the timeless land of the pharaohs along the Nile, and pushed eastward into the mountain fortresses of Afghanistan, across the plains of Pakistan, and into portions of India and Central Asia. Dozens upon dozens of distinct peoples called this empire home: Babylonians, Egyptians, Jews, Lydians, Bactrians, and Greeks, all bound together under the supreme authority of the great king. The Persians had mastered imperial administration like no civilization before them. They'd constructed the famous Royal Road, an ancient superhighway complete with relay stations that could transmit royal decrees from one edge of this massive realm to the other in mere days. This system of provincial governance, managed by appointed officials called satraps, enabled them to control territories spanning millions upon millions of square miles with remarkable administrative efficiency. Darius III himself was far from some pampered royal sitting comfortably on inherited glory. He'd clawed his way to the throne through a brutal period of palace intrigue and bloodshed, proving his personal valor and fighting skill every step of the way. The ancient historian Diodorus recounts how Darius, before ascending to kingship, accepted a challenge of single combat against a fearsome tribal champion during a military campaign. He defeated and killed this warrior in spectacular fashion, earning tremendous honor and catching the eye of the king himself. This was a proven warrior, a capable administrator, and a man absolutely determined to prove himself worthy of following in the footsteps of Cyrus and the great Darius before him. He understood his sacred duty to defend the realm. He was no coward, he was a king. The military machine under his command was the stuff of legend. At its core stood the famous Immortals, 10,000 elite heavy infantry who served as the king's personal guard and the steel backbone of Persian military might. Their name derived from their seemingly supernatural quality. Their ranks were always maintained at exactly 10,000. If one warrior fell in combat, he was instantly replaced, creating the psychological impression of an invincible, eternal fighting force. These weren't common foot soldiers. They were the cream of Persian and Median nobility, outfitted with the absolute finest weapons and scale armor the empire's resources could produce, their spears decorated with silver and golden pomegranates marking their elite status. Beyond the Immortals, Darius could draw upon what seemed like an endless variety of military units. He commanded access to the finest cavalry formations in the world, from the heavily armored horsemen of the eastern steppes to the lightning-fast skirmishing riders of Cappadocia. His infantry ranks included disciplined Persian archers and tough mountain spearmen from Media. He could also summon auxiliary forces from dozens of subject peoples. And crucially, he possessed the financial resources to hire the absolute best professional soldiers that money could buy, thousands of Greek mercenary hoplites, battle-hardened veterans considered the only infantry force in existence capable of standing toe-to-toe with Alexander's legendary phalanx. But perhaps the most devastating advantage Darius wielded was his virtually unlimited treasury. The imperial vaults at Susa, Persepolis, and Babylon overflowed with accumulated tribute from conquered territories, profits from extensive trade networks, and output from gold and silver mines scattered throughout his domains. This staggering wealth enabled him to maintain permanent standing armies, hire tens of thousands of elite mercenaries, and sustain multi-year military campaigns without breaking a financial sweat. Against this colossal, wealthy, and seemingly inexhaustible superpower, Alexander's small kingdom of Macedonia looked like nothing more than an irritating insect challenging a lion. Against this imperial juggernaut stood Alexander of Macedon, a 23-year-old king leading what many sophisticated Persians dismissed as little more than a collection of primitive mountain villages perched on the barbaric edge of the civilized Greek world. And honestly, they weren't entirely wrong. Macedonia was indeed a small, rugged realm, historically overshadowed by the prestigious city-states of Athens, Sparta, and Thebes. But what this kingdom lacked in size and wealth, it compensated for with military innovation, warrior culture, and the sheer earth-shattering ambition of its royal dynasty. Alexander hadn't just inherited a throne from his brilliant, one-eyed father Philip II, he'd inherited a military revolution. Over 2 decades, Philip had taken the disorganized, semi-tribal levies of Macedonia and forged them into the most technologically advanced and lethal professional fighting force the world had ever witnessed. He'd studied the weaknesses in traditional Greek warfare, the dependence on short seasonal campaigns fought by citizen soldiers, and created something entirely revolutionary. He transformed warfare from a ritualized seasonal activity into a calculated science, developing new formations, new weaponry, and new tactical doctrines that would prove devastatingly effective against larger, more traditional armies. The beating heart of Alexander's military machine, its unbreakable anvil, was the Macedonian phalanx. This wasn't your traditional Greek phalanx of hoplites carrying large shields and short spears. Philip's innovation was revolutionary. His infantry carried much smaller shields, freeing both hands to wield a terrifying 18-foot pike called the sarissa. This weapon was so extraordinarily long that the points of the first 5 ranks projected beyond the front of the formation. When these warriors locked their shields and leveled their pikes, they created an almost impenetrable wall of iron tips, a massive, disciplined hedgehog of death that could advance relentlessly forward, grinding down enemy resistance through sheer momentum, and the ability to kill from a distance no other infantry could match. But Alexander's true tactical advantage, the hammer to complement the phalanx's anvil, lay in his cavalry, particularly the elite companion cavalry that he personally led into battle. These weren't just mounted warriors. They were the sons of Macedonian nobility, the absolute finest heavy cavalry in the known world, trained from childhood in horsemanship and the art of mounted warfare. Armed with the deadly 12-foot Zeiston lance, they fought in a revolutionary wedge formation that could concentrate maximum striking power at a single decisive point. allowing them to punch through enemy formations like a spear through cloth, creating gaps that Alexander's supporting units could then ruthlessly exploit. This combined arms system, a holding force in the phalanx and a striking force in the cavalry, was the secret formula behind Macedonian battlefield dominance. Made Alexander truly dangerous, however, wasn't simply the army he'd inherited. It was his personal leadership style, his almost supernatural ability to read battlefield chaos like others read scrolls, and his absolutely insane appetite for personal risk. He didn't command from a safe rear position behind his troops. He led from the absolute front, charging at the head of his companions, his distinctive plumed helmet serving as a beacon for both his own warriors and the enemy. He shared every danger, every wound, every hardship with his soldiers, and through this shared sacrifice he inspired a fanatical personal loyalty that no mercenary force could ever hope to replicate. His soldiers didn't just follow him because he wore a crown, they followed him because they'd witnessed him perform seemingly impossible feats with their own eyes. They believed he was touched by the divine, they believed he was invincible. Alexander's invasion of Persian territory hadn't begun at Issus. It was the culmination of a long, bloody road, a meticulously planned campaign that had already delivered stunning victories and established the young king as a genuine threat. His first major triumph had come over a year earlier, in 334 BC at the Granicus River. There, against the cautious advice of his more experienced generals, Alexander had led what appeared to be a suicidal cavalry charge directly across a fast-flowing river, up a steep muddy embankment, and straight into a prepared Persian defensive position. He'd fought in the front ranks, nearly losing his life multiple times, and in one brutal afternoon had shattered the combined army of the Persian provincial governors of Asia Minor. This victory was more than just a military success. It was a thunderous announcement of his arrival, a clear and bloody declaration to the great king that a serious challenger had landed on his shores. Following that breakthrough, Alexander spent over a year systematically consolidating control over Asia Minor. He marched down the Ionian coast, liberating ancient Greek cities from Persian rule, not as a conqueror but as a cultural liberator. He then pushed into the rugged interior, a campaign that culminated in the legendary episode at Gordium. There he was shown an ancient chariot secured with an impossibly complex knot. Ancient prophecy declared that whoever could untie the Gordian knot would become ruler of all Asia. After wrestling with it briefly, Alexander, in characteristic direct fashion, declared, "It makes no difference how it's loosened," and with one powerful sword stroke cut the knot in half. For his troops and the watching world, the symbolism was unmistakable. This was a man of destiny who didn't play by the old rules, he wrote new ones. This systematic preparation, securing ports, winning allies, building his own legend, was crucial for establishing the logistical foundation he'd need for deeper penetration into the Persian heartland. During this time, Darius, from his magnificent palace in Babylon, had been watching and planning. Initially, he dismissed Alexander as just another Greek troublemaker, a minor irritation to be handled by local governors and their hired swords. The defeat at Granicus was embarrassing, certainly, but it seemed like a regional setback, not an existential threat to the empire itself. But as reports of Macedonian victories continued flooding into his court, as city after city fell, as the legend of the Gordian knot spread like wildfire, the great king realized he was facing something unprecedented. This wasn't a raid for plunder or a limited campaign to free a few Greek cities. Alexander's ambition appeared total. He seemed intent on conquering the entire Persian Empire. The decision for the great king to personally lead an army against Alexander was momentous. In Achaemenid tradition, great kings didn't typically take the field unless the empire's very existence hung in the balance. Their presence on the battlefield signified that this wasn't a border skirmish but a final, existential struggle. By mobilizing the imperial army and marching west from Babylon, Darius was acknowledging to the entire world that Alexander represented a mortal threat to Persian power, a threat that could no longer be delegated to subordinate commanders. The army Darius assembled was massive, even by Persian standards, a force designed not merely to defeat Alexander but to utterly annihilate him. He drew troops from across his vast empire, summoning levies from eastern satrapies that hadn't seen major warfare in generations. Tens of thousands of professional Greek mercenaries were hired to provide a solid, disciplined infantry corps. Persian nobles, as duty demanded, brought their personal retainers and cavalry squadrons. The result was a force that ancient sources claimed exceeded 500,000 men. While modern historians estimate a more realistic figure around 100,000, it was still a colossal host, a moving city of warriors, support personnel, royal courtiers, and camp followers that stretched for miles across the landscape, a terrifying and awe-inspiring symbol of Persian power's seemingly limitless reserves. The initial movements of both armies represented a high-stakes game of strategic cat-and-mouse played across the mountainous terrain of northern Syria. But this intricate dance also set the stage for one of the most consequential and improbable blunders in all of military history. Alexander, his army weakened by a severe fever that had nearly claimed his own life, had recovered and was now driven by an almost desperate urgency to force a decisive confrontation with Darius. He pushed his forces south through a narrow mountain corridor called the Syrian Gates, providing access to the wide-open plains of Syria. This was aggressive, audacious generalship at its absolute finest. Instead of waiting for the colossal Persian army to come to him on ground of their choosing, Alexander was actively hunting for battle, trusting in the speed and superior quality of his hardened veterans. Darius, meanwhile, had camped his massive army on the broad plains of Syria, on the opposite side of the Amanus mountain range. Advised by his experienced Greek mercenary commanders, his plan was to wait for Alexander to emerge from the mountains, then crush the smaller Macedonian force on open ground, where his overwhelming numerical superiority and powerful cavalry would prove decisive. But Darius was an impatient man, surrounded by flattering courtiers who assured him that Alexander was terrified and possibly retreating. Ignoring sound military advice to simply wait, Darius made a fateful decision. He broke camp and chose a different route, leading his massive force north and then west through a separate mountain pass called the Ammanic Gates. His plan, sound in theory, was to emerge behind Alexander's line of march. By cutting Macedonian supply lines and blocking their only retreat route, Darius could trap Alexander against the sea and force the Macedonians to either surrender or turn and fight on entirely Persian terms. What happened next bordered on the absurd. Screened from each other by the rugged peaks of the Amanus Mountains, the two greatest armies of the ancient world, both actively seeking each other out, managed to completely miss their encounter. Like two massive ships passing in a storm, Alexander's army marched south along the western side of the mountains, while Darius's much larger force marched north along the eastern side. Neither commander had adequate reconnaissance in the difficult terrain, and neither realized what had occurred until it was far too late to easily correct the situation. For Darius, the realization that he now stood behind Alexander's army must have felt like divine intervention, a sign from the gods of his rightful sovereignty. He'd brilliantly outmaneuvered his celebrated opponent. His forces descended from the mountains and captured the town of Issus, which Alexander had recently left as a rear base and field hospital. In a shocking display of brutality that revealed his growing arrogance and frustration, Darius ordered the sick and wounded Macedonian soldiers who'd been left there to be tortured, mutilated, and executed. He wanted to send a message of pure terror to the man who dared defy him. The psychological impact of his position seemed, in his mind, total. Alexander's army was now completely severed from supply lines, isolated from bases in Asia Minor, with zero hope of reinforcement or resupply. The young Macedonian upstart was cornered, surrounded deep in hostile territory. The trap had sprung shut. Victory, Darius and his commanders firmly believed, was now merely a formality. The tension is absolutely building now, isn't it? This is where our story becomes truly incredible. Before I reveal how Alexander transformed this seemingly impossible nightmare into his greatest triumph, take just a second to hit that like button if you're enjoying this epic journey through ancient warfare. Your support genuinely helps us create more incredible historical content like this. When Alexander's reconnaissance cavalry, sent back on a tactical hunch, returned at full gallop with the shocking intelligence that Darius's entire colossal army was now positioned behind them, occupying their rear, the initial reaction throughout the Macedonian camp was one of cold, stomach-churning dread. The strategic situation had reversed in an instant. They were no longer hunters, they'd become the hunted. They were trapped, isolated 1,000 miles from home, with a massive, vengeful Persian army blocking their only escape route. Panic began rippling through the ranks. Even Alexander's most senior and battle-hardened officers, grizzled veterans of countless campaigns, were visibly shaken. They gathered in worried clusters, discussing the seemingly hopeless situation, with some beginning to whisper the previously unthinkable, negotiating surrender terms or attempting a desperate fighting withdrawal back through the mountain passes. Alexander himself, his reaction was entirely different. The ancient historians tell us that upon hearing the news, Alexander let out a cry of pure, unadulterated joy. Where his men saw catastrophe, he saw divine opportunity. Where his most trusted advisors perceived a fatal trap, he recognized a gift from the gods, a miraculous turn of events that would enable him to achieve something that might otherwise have been impossible, a final, decisive confrontation with Darius himself. not on wide-open plains where Persian numerical superiority would be crushing, but here, in this constricted space, on ground of Alexander's choosing. Gathering his terrified commanders, his face illuminated with a confidence that must have seemed like madness, Alexander delivered a speech that has echoed through military history. He didn't downplay the danger, he redefined it completely. The gods themselves, he declared, are fighting on our side, for they have put it into Darius's mind to abandon the open plains and cram his vast host into this narrow corridor between mountain and sea. He explained with piercing tactical clarity what this meant. Darius, in his arrogance and impatience, had willingly sacrificed his single greatest advantage, numerical superiority. The battle wouldn't be decided by who commanded more soldiers, but by who commanded better soldiers. And in that contest, Alexander had zero doubt of the outcome. This wasn't mere theatrical bravado. It was the product of a supreme tactical mind. Alexander understood something that Darius, in his eagerness to spring the trap, had catastrophically failed to grasp. The narrow coastal plain of Issus would function as a great equalizer. It would physically prevent the Persians from deploying their full strength, from using their cavalry to envelop his flanks. Instead of facing 100,000 enemies simultaneously, his small elite army would be fighting only those Persians who could actually fit into the constricted battle line. Darius hadn't trapped Alexander's army, he trapped his own. Psychological impact of Alexander's unshakable confidence on his troops was immediate and electrifying. Fear transformed into a surge of adrenaline and renewed purpose. Instead of dwelling on their dangerous, isolated position, the Macedonians began focusing on the glorious opportunity before them. Their king, the demigod they'd followed to the edge of the known world, had just told them victory wasn't just possible, it was divinely guaranteed. They were no longer cornered animals awaiting slaughter. They were instruments of fate about to face the great king himself in a battle for the world, a battle their own king was telling them they couldn't possibly lose. With morale restored and purpose crystallized, Alexander gave the order, turn the army around and march north to meet their destiny. The narrow plain of Issus was perhaps the worst possible terrain in the entire region for deploying a massive cavalry-heavy army, yet Darius had committed himself to fighting there, and now had to make the absolute best of a strategically disastrous situation. The battlefield was barely a mile and a half wide, a cramped corridor of land squeezed between the impassable Amanus Mountains on one side and the Mediterranean coastline on the other. Running diagonally through the middle of this already constricted space flowed the Pinarus River. Though not particularly deep, its steep, slippery banks and rocky riverbed would serve as a natural defensive barrier, a formidable obstacle that could shatter the cohesion of any attacking force. Darius, despite his initial strategic blunder, deployed his forces with meticulous attention to detail that Persian military doctrine demanded. To make the river an even stronger defensive position, he ordered construction of palisades and earthworks along sections of the riverbank where crossing was easiest. His deployment followed classic defensive principles, designed to absorb the Macedonian assault and then destroy it through overwhelming numbers. His center, the anchor of his entire battle line, was held by his most reliable and professional troops, 30,000 Greek mercenary hoplites. These were battle-hardened veterans from across the Greek world who fought for Persian gold. They were positioned in a deep, solid formation directly along the riverbank, where they could exploit the natural obstacle to break the momentum of the Macedonian phalanx's assault. The Persian right wing, extending toward the coast where terrain was flattest, was where Darius positioned the bulk of his finest cavalry units. This was the traditional position of strength in Persian deployments, and the open ground near the sea was ideal for the sweeping mounted operations at which they excelled. Here, thousands of Persian noble cavalry, heavily armored horsemen from Media and auxiliary squadrons from across the empire, prepared to shatter the Macedonian left flank, sweep around behind their army, and deliver the decisive battle-winning blow. The Persian left wing, a massive force stretching from the center up into the Rocky Mountain foothills, was packed with tens of thousands of lighter infantry called cardaces. These weren't elite troops, but they were numerous, adequately equipped, and more than sufficient for holding ground against what the Persians expected would be a desperate Macedonian assault. Their job was simple: hold the line and pin Alexander's best troops in place. Most significantly, Darius himself, in accordance with Persian royal tradition, took his position in the absolute center of the line, mounted on his magnificent war chariot. He was surrounded by his personal guard, the 10,000 elite Immortals, and the finest of his kinsmen cavalry. This wasn't merely ceremonial placement. It was a powerful statement of royal confidence, and a guarantee that the great king would personally oversee what he believed would be the glorious final destruction of the Macedonian upstart. From this central vantage point, he would command his seemingly invincible host to a victory that would secure his throne and legacy forever. As Alexander's army advanced, he deployed his forces with the fluid, adaptive brilliance that would cement his reputation as one of history's greatest battlefield commanders. Unlike Darius, who was essentially trying to force a massive square peg into a round hole by cramming his enormous army into inadequate space, Alexander perceived the terrain not as a limitation but as an opportunity. He crafted a battle plan specifically designed to exploit the unique, constricted characteristics of the Issus battlefield, turning the narrow ground into a weapon that would work for him. On his left flank, directly facing the most powerful concentration of Persian cavalry near the coast, Alexander positioned his allied Greek and Thessalian cavalry squadrons under the command of Parmenion, his most trusted, cautious, and experienced general. Parmenion's task was arguably the most difficult of the entire battle. He was dangerously outnumbered, facing the elite of Persian horsemen on terrain most favorable to them. But Alexander's instructions were telling. Parmenion wasn't expected to win on that flank. His orders were simply to hold ground at all costs, to bend but never break, and to prevent a Persian breakthrough for as long as humanly possible. This was a crucial defensive anchor, acknowledging Persian advantage on that sector while trusting his most reliable general to perform a vital holding action. Alexander's center was occupied by the unbreakable heart of his army, the 6 battalions of the Macedonian phalanx. These heavily armored infantrymen, hardened veterans of countless campaigns, formed a solid, disciplined wall of steel points. Armed with their fearsome 18-foot sarissas, they would advance in perfect lockstep across the difficult terrain of the Pinarus River, trusting in superior equipment, relentless training, and proven ability to grind down any enemy infantry. Their job was to fix the Persian center, the Greek mercenaries, in place and methodically, inexorably destroy them. But it was on Alexander's right wing, stretching from the phalanx toward the mountain foothills, where his true aggressive intentions crystallized. Here he massed his elite offensive units, his hypaspists, the royal shield bearers, elite light infantry who could fight in both phalanx formation and open order, his archers and elite agranians, javelin men considered the absolute best skirmishers in the ancient world, and at the far right his ultimate striking force, the hammer of his army, the elite companion cavalry which he would personally lead into battle. This wasn't a defensive flank. From the outset, it was designed to be his primary offensive weapon, the spearhead that would deliver the decisive battle-winning blow. As he surveyed the vast Persian line, he noticed their left wing extended much further up into the foothills than his own forces could match, creating a serious threat of envelopment. In response, Alexander made a final brilliant tactical adjustment. He held back a portion of his light infantry and cavalry at a 45-degree angle behind his right wing, creating what military historians call a refused flank or echelon formation. This revolutionary flexible formation could act as a defensive hinge, ready to pivot and counter any Persian attempt at outflanking from the mountains, but it could also function as a reserve, ready to be committed to the main attack at the decisive moment. With dispositions complete, Alexander rode along the entire front of his army, calling out to commanders and even individual soldiers by name. His presence, his supreme confidence, was a final electrifying tonic for his men before they advanced into the jaws of a battle where they were outnumbered, but one he'd already decided they would win. When Alexander finally gave the order to advance, his entire army began moving forward with the disciplined, almost eerie precision that terrorized their enemies. But characteristically, the young king didn't simply order a straightforward charge directly into the teeth of prepared Persian defenses. Instead, he initiated his attack with an ingenious diagonal advance, a maneuver designed to create confusion, probe for weaknesses, and force the enemy to react to him. He personally led his right wing, the companions and hypaspists, not directly toward the river but at an oblique angle, moving steadily to his right, parallel to the Persian line. This oblique approach was vintage Alexander, aggressive, unconventional, deeply unsettling for opponents. The Persians watched as Alexander's elite units seemed to drift away from the main battle, moving toward the mountain foothills. Was he attempting a massive, risky flanking maneuver? Was he trying to draw them out? This sense of menace and unpredictability forced Persian commanders on that flank to react. The Persian infantry stationed on their left flank, the lightly armed Cardaces packed into the foothills, watched this sideways movement and feared they were about to be outflanked and enveloped. On their own initiative or following panicked orders from local commanders, they did exactly what Alexander hoped. They abandoned their strong, elevated defensive positions and charged downhill to intercept Alexander's cavalry, hoping to pin them against the river. In doing so, they disrupted their own carefully arranged formation, surrendered the advantage of high ground, and most critically, began opening a gap between themselves and the Greek mercenaries holding the Persian center. The moment the Persian left began moving, breaking its cohesion, Alexander knew his opportunity had arrived. With a single trumpet blast, he gave the order. He immediately wheeled the companion cavalry from their diagonal march into their devastating wedge formation, a tactical innovation concentrating the power of hundreds of horses and lances into a single piercing point, while maintaining remarkable control and cohesion. What followed was one of the most famous and decisive cavalry charges in all of military history. With a thunderous war cry to his divine ancestor Heracles, Alexander spurred Bucephalus forward, leading his horsemen not at the Cardaces who charged down from the hills, but at the now exposed flank of the Persian left center. He led his companions directly into and across the Pinarus River, ignoring the treacherous terrain, and smashed with overwhelming force into the flank of the Persian line. The psychological and physical impact on the lightly armed Cardaces was catastrophic. These troops, adequate for holding defensive positions, were utterly unprepared for a flank assault by the finest, most feared heavy cavalry in the world, led by a king who fought like a vengeful deity. Their line and their nerve shattered instantly. The center holds. While Alexander was achieving his spectacular breakthrough on the right wing, a desperate and bloody crisis was unfolding in the center of the battlefield. The situation here was far more precarious than Alexander's triumphant charge. The Macedonian phalanx, the unbreakable heart of his army, found itself attempting to cross the Pinarus River while maintaining its rigid, carefully drilled formation. It was a near impossible task. The river's steep, slippery, muddy banks combined with the uneven, stony riverbed absolutely shattered their cohesion. The perfect interlocking wall of shields and sarissas dissolved into fragmented, struggling battalions. Men slipped and fell in churning water. Their long pikes became unwieldy burdens. All the while, they endured constant harassing fire from Persian archers and javelin throwers positioned on the opposite bank. As the Macedonians, wet, disorganized, exhausted, finally struggled up the far bank, still desperately trying to reform their lines, they were met by a solid wall of professional killers. Here stood Darius's best infantry, 30,000 Greek mercenaries, the backbone of the Persian center. What followed wasn't a quick, decisive charge. It was a brutal, grinding, shield-to-shield shoving match, a horrific infantry battle called the Othismos that would determine the fate of empires. These Greek mercenaries weren't intimidated. They were experienced professional soldiers who'd fought in vicious intercity wars across the Greek world. They understood Macedonian tactics intimately and held no particular awe for the phalanx's reputation. More importantly, they held every tactical advantage, fighting on dry, stable ground from prepared, fortified positions against an enemy still scrambling to reform after difficult river crossing. They were fresh. The Macedonians were weary. For several terrifying, heart-stopping minutes, it appeared the Macedonian advance would be stopped cold and then annihilated. The phalanx battalions, unable to properly bring the full weight of their sarissas to bear, found themselves pressed hard by opponents who matched their professionalism and discipline while significantly exceeding their numbers. The brutal shoving match became a contest of pure grinding attrition. Shields splintered, spears snapped, men screamed as the two lines mashed against each other. Individual Macedonian units, taking catastrophic casualties, began giving ground. Gaps, a fatal weakness for any phalanx, started appearing in what had been an unbroken line of steel points. One battalion, commanded by Ptolemy, was nearly wiped out, its commander killed in brutal melee. This was the moment of maximum danger for Alexander's entire army. The anchor of his battle line, the force upon which his entire strategy depended, was on the verge of complete collapse. If the center broke, Greek mercenaries could pour through the gap, rolling up both flanks and achieving the decisive, overwhelming victory Darius had anticipated. The fate of the battle, Alexander's life, and perhaps the entire course of his invasion hung precariously in the balance, as his exhausted Macedonian pikemen struggled desperately to maintain footing against ferocious, determined resistance from their countrymen fighting for Persian gold. What happened next demonstrated why Alexander earned his reputation as one of history's greatest battlefield commanders, a leader who possessed not just raw courage, but an almost supernatural sense of timing and battlefield awareness. Having achieved his spectacular breakthrough against the Persian left wing, a lesser glory-seeking general might have impulsively pursued thousands of fleeing enemy troops, chasing them for miles into the hills, claiming an easy, glorious local victory. But Alexander was no ordinary general. With a glance back over his shoulder, he saw the crisis unfolding in the center. He saw his own phalanx, his unbreakable anvil, buckling, on the verge of shattering. He possessed the incredible tactical discipline to recognize that the real decisive battle was still being fought and potentially lost in the bloody grind along the riverbank. Ignoring the temptation of glorious pursuit, Alexander reined in his horse, his trumpet sounding the rally signal. With shouts and hand signals, he rallied the victorious companion cavalry, pulling them back from the intoxicating thrill of the chase. He wheeled his entire elite squadron around, their horses churning muddy ground, preparing for a second, even more critical charge. This time, his target wasn't the already broken Persian left wing. It was the exposed, vulnerable flank of the Greek mercenaries who were so dangerously close to breaking his own phalanx. The impact of this second cavalry charge was devastating and immediate. The Greek mercenaries, their entire focus and energy committed to the brutal head-on shoving match with Macedonian infantry, had no reserves, no warning, and absolutely no defense against this sudden thunderous assault from their side. They were caught in a perfect trap, attacked simultaneously from the front by irresistible pressure from Sarissa pikes and from the flank by the finest heavy cavalry in the world. Their disciplined professional formation, which had been on the verge of victory mere moments before, began to buckle and then crumble into chaos. This was the turning point of the entire battle. The anchor of Darius's army had been broken. With his elite center units now collapsing, and his left wing already routed and fleeing for the mountains, Darius, watching from his chariot, could see his carefully planned victory dissolving into a nightmare of chaos and slaughter. But Alexander wasn't finished. Having broken the mercenary line and saved his own infantry, he rallied his companions for a third, final, relentless cavalry charge. This one wasn't aimed at a flank or crumbling line. This charge was aimed like a spear directly at the heart of Persian command, at the great king himself. The sight of Alexander, his armor now caked in dust and blood, his face a mask of furious determination, reforming his victorious cavalry and leading them straight toward the royal position, was more than Darius could endure. The great king, who'd come to the battlefield expecting to watch the clinical destruction of a barbarian upstart, now found himself face to face with a warrior whose tactical brilliance and seemingly divine fury had just systematically destroyed two-thirds of his magnificent army. The whirlwind of battle was no longer a distant spectacle. It was coming directly for him. The moment Darius II, King of Kings, ruler of the world's greatest empire, turned his magnificent royal chariot and fled the battlefield was one of the most consequential acts of cowardice in all of ancient history. This wasn't simply the retreat of an individual ruler fearing for his life. It was the catastrophic collapse of the entire Persian command structure and the final irreversible signal for complete military disaster. His personal terror became his empire's death warrant. Persian military doctrine, and indeed their entire imperial ideology, placed enormous, almost mystical emphasis on the person of the great king. He wasn't merely a commander-in-chief in the modern sense. He was the living embodiment of imperial authority, the center of the Persian universe, the chosen representative of the god Ahura Mazda on earth. His presence on the battlefield was a sacred guarantee of divine favor. When his soldiers, drawn from 100 different lands, speaking 100 different languages, saw their divine king fleeing in abject panic, the message was unambiguous and soul-crushing. The gods themselves had abandoned the Persian cause. For them, continuing to fight wasn't just futile, it was potentially sacrilegious, an act of defiance against now obvious divine judgment. The psychological impact of Darius's flight spread through remaining Persian ranks like wildfire. On the Persian right, where elite cavalry had been on the verge of breaking Parmenian's flank, commanders suddenly saw the royal standard disappearing in a cloud of dust. Units that had been fighting effectively, even winning their sector of the battle, suddenly found themselves leaderless and demoralized. The carefully maintained discipline holding the massive multi-ethnic Persian army together dissolved almost instantly, replaced by contagious individual panic and desperate primal desire for self-preservation. What had been an organized, centrally commanded military force became a terrified, headless mob in mere moments. Tens of thousands of Persian soldiers, many of whom had never even engaged the enemy, having been held in rear ranks, saw chaos unfolding, saw their king's flight, and simply threw down heavy shields and weapons and ran for their lives. The narrow plain of Issus, the very terrain Darius had chosen to trap Alexander, now became a horrific death trap for his own fleeing army. The fleeing Persians, their formations shattered, found themselves bottlenecked between impassable mountains and the unforgiving sea, with nowhere to escape the vengeful pursuing Macedonians who now owned the battlefield. The collapse of Persian resistance at Issus was total, catastrophic, and shockingly swift. On the left wing where Alexander had achieved his initial breakthrough, the terrified Cardaces were already streaming toward mountain safety in complete disorder, hunted down by Alexander's light infantry. In the center, professional Greek mercenaries who'd fought so valiantly and come so close to breaking the Macedonian phalanx were now completely surrounded. With their paymaster gone and formation shattered, they were caught in a hopeless position between relentlessly advancing Sarissa pikes to their front and vengeful companion cavalry charges to their rear. For them, there was no escape, only brutal annihilation or the humiliation of surrender. Even on the Persian right wing, where Mazius's cavalry had been performing so well, Darius's flight triggered immediate and irreversible collapse. Persian horsemen who'd been preparing for what they believed would be a battle-winning assault suddenly found themselves leaderless, their central command evaporated. They now faced an enemy no longer concerned with desperate defense. Parmenion, seeing the Persian line waver, seized the moment. His superb Thessalian cavalry, having successfully held ground through hours of brutal fighting, now launched their own ferocious counterattack. They smashed into disorganized and demoralized Persian horsemen, turning what had been near victory for Persians into another chaotic, bloody rout. The casualties were staggering and grotesquely one-sided. While Alexander's army, according to ancient sources, may have lost only a few hundred men, testament to the speed and decisiveness of his victory, Persian losses numbered in the tens of thousands. The narrow plain and banks of the Pinarus River were choked with bodies of men and horses. More importantly than raw numbers was who those losses represented. Alexander hadn't just defeated a provincial levy, he'd annihilated the grand army of the Persian Empire, killing many of the noble cavalry and elite infantry commanders who formed the very backbone of Persian military power. It was a blow from which the empire's military prestige would never recover. But the material consequences of victory extended far beyond battlefield casualties. In his panicked haste to escape, Darius had abandoned not just his army but everything else defining his royal power. When victorious Macedonians entered the opulent Persian camp, they were stunned by what they found. Left behind was an enormous treasure, a king's ransom in gold and silver coins and bullion representing years of imperial tax collection and tribute payments. Alexander had just acquired financial resources to fund his campaigns for the foreseeable future, freeing him from any reliance on his distant homeland. The conqueror, in a single afternoon, had become the wealthiest man in the world. Even more significant than mountains of captured treasure was another priceless prize Darius had abandoned in his panicked flight, his own family. Left behind in the chaos of the royal camp were his mother, the formidable Queen Mother Sisygambis, his beautiful wife Statera, his young son and heir, and his daughters. In the ancient world, these weren't just family members. They were powerful symbols of imperial legitimacy, the living embodiment of the Achaemenid dynasty's right to rule. In Darius's hands, they were his family. In Alexander's hands, they were the keys to an empire. Alexander's treatment of the captured royal family in the immediate aftermath of bloody battle revealed a political sophistication and masterful understanding of psychological warfare, perhaps even more brilliant than his battlefield tactics. Hearing that royal women were in his camp and believed Darius was dead, and they were to be executed or dishonored, Alexander immediately sent a messenger assuring them of their safety and their king's survival. He then, in a gesture of profound respect, went to visit them himself, accompanied by his closest friend and general, Hephaestion. What happened next is one of the most famous and revealing anecdotes of Alexander's life. Upon his entrance, Darius's mother Sisygambis, overwhelmed by grief and fear, mistook the taller and by some accounts more handsome Hephaestion for the king and prostrated herself before him. As Hephaestion stepped back in embarrassment and guards moved to correct her, Alexander simply helped the old queen to her feet and said with incredible grace, "Don't worry, mother, you're not mistaken. He too is Alexander." With this single brilliant statement, he not only spared her any humiliation but elevated his friend to status of his equal, a profound sign of affection and a demonstration of magnanimity utterly alien to rigid Persian court hierarchies. This wasn't just chivalry, it was calculated, masterful policy. He assured royal women they'd be treated not as prisoners or hostages but with all honor and respect due their royal status, promising to care for them as if he were their own son. This act of clemency was a devastating propaganda weapon. The contrast with Darius couldn't have been more stark or more damaging to the great king's prestige. Here was the king of kings who'd twice fled the battlefield, abandoning his armies and now his own family, while the young Macedonian barbarian was treating Persian royalty with more honor and compassion than their own ruler had shown. The story of this encounter spread like wildfire throughout the Persian Empire, doing more to undermine Darius's legitimacy than any military defeat. Alexander's magnanimous treatment of royal captives also served another crucial forward-thinking purpose. It sent a clear, powerful message to Persian nobles, satraps, and city governors still standing in his path. Surrender to Alexander didn't necessarily mean death or destruction. It signaled he wasn't merely a destructive invader but a potential worthy successor to the Persian throne, one who understood and respected the traditions of empire. This policy of clemency toward willing collaborators would prove absolutely essential in coming years as he pushed deeper into the Persian heartland, encouraging cities and provinces to open their gates rather than resist to the last man. The Battle of Issus was more than just another victory. It was a fundamental, world-altering event that completely transformed the entire strategic situation in the Eastern Mediterranean. Before the battle, Alexander had been a brilliant but vulnerable invader, operating at the end of perilously long supply lines 1,000 miles from home, always susceptible to being cut off or ground down by seemingly limitless Persian resources. After the battle, he'd become something else entirely. He was no longer just an invader. He was a conqueror with financial resources, military momentum, and now, through his treatment of the royal family, the burgeoning legitimacy to challenge Persian power throughout its vast domains. The immediate strategic benefits were enormous and cascaded with breathtaking speed. With Darius's grand army utterly destroyed and the great king himself a discredited fugitive, the entire Persian defensive system in the western half of the empire collapsed. The rich province of Syria, with ancient cities and vital trade routes, now lay open to Macedonian conquest. More importantly, wealthy and powerful Phoenician cities along the coast, Byblos, Sidon, and eventually Tyre, were now within his grasp. By capturing these great naval bases, Alexander could achieve a crucial strategic objective: neutralization of the Persian fleet. Without friendly ports to resupply, the Persian navy, which had once threatened to cut his communication lines back to Greece, would wither on the vine, effectively ceding control of the entire Mediterranean to him. Furthermore, the path to Egypt, the wealthiest and most ancient province of the Persian Empire, was now clear. The Egyptians, who had a long, bitter history of resenting Persian rule, could now be approached not as a conqueror demanding submission, but as a liberator offering freedom from overlords. The victory at Issus gave Alexander the keys to the entire western portion of Darius's empire. But perhaps most importantly, Alexander had demonstrated something that had seemed impossible to the world before Issus. He'd proven in a direct, head-to-head confrontation that the colossal military power of the Persian Empire could be decisively defeated by a relatively small but brilliantly led and highly motivated army. This stunning revelation would echo like a thunderclap across the Persian Empire. It would encourage restive populations to rebel against Persian masters and would make it infinitely easier for Alexander to recruit local allies and auxiliaries for future campaigns. Why remain loyal to a losing empire when you could join the side of a seemingly invincible, God-blessed conqueror? The psychological impact of the battle extended far beyond military considerations and struck at the very heart of Persian imperial authority. Darius was no longer the remote, invincible, semi-divine great king ruling by mandate of Ahura Mazda. He was now a man who'd twice fled from battle, a commander who'd abandoned not just his armies but his own mother, wife, and children to save himself. His authority, his prestige, his very right to rule were now open to question in every satrap's court from Babylon to Bactria. Ambitious provincial governors and powerful generals would now begin quietly calculating whether their future interests lay with a discredited, fleeing king or with a charismatic, victorious, and seemingly unstoppable young conqueror from the west. The seeds of the empire's final internal collapse had been sown in the mud of the Pinarus River. The Battle of Issus stands as one of the most remarkable and complete reversals of fortune in all of military history. What began as a carefully laid Persian trap, a strategic checkmate that should have ended Alexander's invasion, instead became the very foundation of his eventual conquest of the entire Persian Empire. Through a breathtaking combination of tactical brilliance, unwavering self-confidence, personal courage, and an almost supernatural ability to read the flow of battle, Alexander had not just escaped the trap, he'd turned it back on his opponent, transforming a moment of certain defeat into an overwhelming, world-changing victory. The young king who'd seemed trapped, isolated, and helpless just hours before was now the undisputed master of the battlefield, possessor of the Persian royal family, the symbolic keys to the empire, and a treasury so vast it would fuel his future conquests all the way to the shores of India. In stark contrast, Darius, the mighty king of kings who'd come to Issus expecting to swat a barbarian upstart, was now a discredited and dishonored fugitive, a ruler whose very legitimacy had been shattered by his conduct on the battlefield. The hunter hadn't just become the hunted, he'd lost his kingdom in the process. This wasn't just another ancient battle. It was the moment when the balance of power in the ancient world, a balance that had held for over 2 centuries, shifted irrevocably. The Achaemenid Persian Empire, the superpower that had dominated the known world from the Danube to the Indus, was now facing an existential challenge from an enemy who'd proven capable of defeating its best troops, outmaneuvering its most experienced commanders, and breaking the will of its great king. The myth of Persian invincibility, already cracked at Granicus, was now shattered beyond repair. Alexander's victory at Issus was the key that unlocked the rest of the world for him. It opened the path to vital ports of Syria and Phoenicia, the ancient wealth of Egypt, and eventually to the very heart of the Persian Empire itself. It was the day a 23-year-old Macedonian king proved to the world, and perhaps most importantly to himself, that he possessed the skill, the courage, the ambition, and the divine favor to reshape the ancient world according to his own extraordinary vision. The road to Gorgamla and to the title, the Great, began here in the bloody waters of the Pinarus River. If this incredible story of tactical genius and ancient warfare has captured your imagination, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into history's most fascinating battles. Share this video with anyone who loves military history or stories of impossible victories, and let me know in the comments, do you think Darius's downfall was caused by his own arrogance, or was Alexander simply an unstoppable force of nature? Thanks for joining us on this journey through one of history's most decisive moments, and I'll see you in the next episode where we continue following Alexander's incredible conquest of the ancient world.